Atheist Alliance International podcast with Andy Phillips.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hi and welcome to the Atheist Alliance International podcast with me, Andy Phillips. Now, a little while ago we had a conversation, a podcast with Greg Dawes, Professor Greg Dawes of Otago University in New Zealand. And we was talking about Galileo and the conflict between science and religion. Now, during that conversation and after that conversation, we discovered that Greg had been a priest for around about 10 years, had left the priesthood and became non-religious. Now, that was a very, very interesting fact that we didn't really know prior to the podcast. So we decided to ask Greg to come back and really just talk a little bit about his journey from the priesthood and out of religion. And this is what happened. So we got Greg Dawes and obviously Jason Sylvester as well online. Hi guys, how you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Now we're going to talk about a very interesting subject, and well, it's all about you, Greg. It's all about you. It's all about your journey. You out the priesthood and to the dark side, I guess you'd call it. How did it start? What sort of drove you to leaving religion?
Well, perhaps I should begin with what drove me to embracing it.
that would be actually a very good start. Yeah.
Before I get on to why I left it, I guess I was lucky in a way to be brought up in a very sort of broad-minded Roman Catholic family. My father had been a convert to Catholicism as a young man. He had gone from a vaguely Anglican family to a quite committed Roman Catholic. But he was always a very thoughtful convert. He did a lot of reading. When Hans Küng, the Swiss theologian who questioned the doctrine of papal infallibility, I think Jason's writing about the development of belief about papal authority at the moment, which is an important topic. And Hans Küng got himself into some trouble as a Roman Catholic priest and theologian for questioning the doctrine of papal infallibility. But when he visited Dunedin many years ago, my father was called upon to interview him as a lay person with an interest in this area. So somewhere on my bookshelf, I've got an autographed copy of Hans Küng's book, Attacking the Doctrine of Papal Infallibility. So this certainly wasn't a Catholic family in which, you weren't allowed to ask questions about religion. On the contrary, we had lively discussions about religion all the time. And my father used to say that he'd prefer his children left the church because they were thinking about it than just stayed in the church without thinking. Because he was confident, of course, that if they left the church but kept thinking, they would eventually come back. Now, who knows? He may be right yet. I'm still alive. I'm still breathing. I'm still thinking. Who knows what's going to happen? I can't see it at the moment, but nonetheless, this was the kind of atmosphere in which I was brought up, in which thinking and questioning was encouraged and permitted. So I think actually partly because of that, I felt no particular need to rebel against the church. I saw it as a kind of relatively benign environment, even intellectually quite welcoming, because that had been my experience. And likewise, when I eventually decided to try out for the priesthood and enter the seminary, I was taught by Jesuit priests who were very learned men. We studied, for a start, the first 2 years, we studied philosophy. That was the pattern back in those days. 2 years of philosophy, 4 years of theology. But the philosophy we studied wasn't particularly Christian. We studied quite a lot of continental philosophy. I studied Gabriel Marcel, who was a French Catholic existentialist thinker, but a good friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir. We studied Heidegger, we studied, as well as Thomas Aquinas and some of the classic Roman Catholic philosophers. So we had a very broad kind of intellectual introduction to studying Catholicism. It was in this context of studying philosophy more generally, which I think was wonderful. It was a great introduction to the intellectual life. And these very learned men who taught us were, again, people of considerable breadth of knowledge. So I suppose for these reasons, I never felt that being in the church was kind of an intellectual straitjacket. Quite the contrary, it was kind of an environment in which you were encouraged to think. Now, I guess I was just lucky in this respect, but that was my experience. So for many years, I worked happily enough within the priesthood for about 12 years in total. At a certain point, though, I was summoned by the local bishop and told that I was going to go off to Rome to study. And he really wanted someone to study biblical studies, the academic study of the Bible, and to come back and teach biblical studies in the local seminary. At that time, I wasn't particularly interested in biblical studies. I was more interested in philosophy. But, when you're told by your bishop to do something, then you do it. And here was an opportunity to go to Rome to study, so it would be foolish to turn it down. So off I went to study in Rome. And I lived there in a college with there were about 150 student priests living in this college, all of whom were studying different things in Rome. Interestingly, because New Zealand was technically still a missionary country for historical reasons, I was living in a college with about 80 of my fellow priests there were from Africa and about another 20 or 30 from India. So I was kind of, as a Westerner, as it were, kind of a minority, but it was great. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful sense of the breadth of Catholicism, the kind of range of circumstances in which people lived out their Catholic faith. I remember a couple of days after I got to the college, just before the evening meal, we had a special announcement because one of the priests who had been there a couple of years before had gone back to, I think it was Angola, which at that time was in a state of war. And he and a nun working with him had been caught and shot by rebels while trying to take a pregnant woman to the hospital. And I thought, my goodness, this is a very different world in which to be a priest from the one I was brought up on. But it gave me an awareness of, the diversity of Catholicism, which was great. And again, these were, for the most part, very impressive young men. They were great, very interesting people to work with. However, studying biblical studies is interesting because the academic study of the Bible is, in a sense, not really a theological enterprise. I mean, it's theological in the sense that why would you study the Bible unless you believed that it had a particular significance? But on the other hand, the way in which we studied the Bible was as a historical document written by human beings at a particular point in time for a particular purpose. And this had been encouraged by the church itself at the Second Vatican Council, 1965, 63 to 65, thereabouts. Can't remember the precise dates. Big gathering of Roman Catholic bishops in Rome, Second Vatican Council, to update the church. Revolutionary event in the history of modern Catholicism. Some popes since have been trying to roll it back. The present pope is more in support of it, but in case of revolutionary event.
Were you a priest at that time at the Second Vatican Council, or you came after?
No, I was too young. I was only about 8 years old at that point. So, okay. But my father had followed it with great interest. In fact, had run study groups in our local parish for people wanting to know about what was happening at this council in Rome. But one of the things the council did was endorse the historical study of the Bible, to say, look, sure, the Bible is God's word, we take this for granted, but it's transmitted through the work of human beings, writing in particular literary genres, which are characteristic of the time, they had a particular purpose, so writing for a particular audience. We need to understand the Bible as the product of a particular time and place. Sure, it's God's word, we're taking this for granted, but God is speaking through human beings who are historically located and culturally conditioned. So of course they have certain views about the world that we would regard as false, because that's the time they were living in. You know, they didn't know about Copernican astronomy or whatever. That's fine. Why would they? They were human beings writing under divine guidance, but nonetheless writing as human beings of a particular time and place. Now, this has kind of a revolutionary effect, I think, on how you think about the Bible. It's no longer sort of simply handed down from heaven. It emerges from human experience. And however much you might want to think of that human experience as guided by the Holy Spirit, that's fine. It's still human experience. And at this point, of course, the Bible begins to look very much like anyone else's set of scriptures. Okay, there's the Bible, but there's also the Bhagavad Gita, there are the Vedas, there's the Quran, there's, I spent some years ago studying the Book of Mormon, which is another very interesting modern set of scriptures. I think I'm one of the few non-Mormons to have read the whole Book of Mormon. But it's so, at this point you see what's happening, this kind of a relativizing going on. Sure, this is your religion, but it's actually looking pretty much like other people's religion. So we have all these religions, of which yours is merely one.
So
and I
it's
think
a much more subjective view then. You looked at it in a more subjective way.
I guess it's not so much, I have a deep aversion to the word subjective, which I think has too many meanings. But I think I wouldn't say subjective so much as kind of relative to a particular time and place. This is a challenge that German scholars in the 19th century described as the challenge of historicism. Once you begin to look at something historically, you see it as very particular to your time and place. But it's no longer self-evidently the only way to look at things, because you discover that other people have looked at things very differently. So it's a kind of subjectivity, I suppose, but it's more kind of a realization that your culture's point of view or your religion's point of view is simply one among many and can no longer claim to be sort of self-evidently correct. And of course, this is a discovery that's greatly altered Western culture in modern times. Anthropologists have done a lot to contribute to this, of course, by going off and studying other societies and discovering that they have their own way of doing things, which is perfectly reasonable given their assumptions, just different from ours. And so in the study of the Bible, one came across the same kind of shift. Once you began studying the Bible historically, then your attitude to the Bible and to religion generally began to shift.
What was your attitude to God, though, when you went into the church? I mean, what was your mindset? Was it just, it's obvious, it's always been obvious, that's how I was brought up? Was that the sort of mindset you had at the time? You didn't question it at all?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. No, I think I did question it, and I did think about it. At the time, I remember saying to someone that, during some period of my being a priest, that, look, here we have a big sort of large-scale hypothesis, as it were, that accounts for a whole lot of things. It offers an explanation of a whole lot of things. It seems plausible. It's got a lot to be said for it. It's kind of like of course, which I talked about last time, my PhD thesis in philosophy was on theistic explanations. And you can offer the existence of God as a quite plausible kind of explanation. But of course, it also offers a way of making sense of your own life, a kind of shaping. It gives shape and form to your life. I've always thought this about Islam, actually. One of the things I find attractive about Islam is that with its rituals of praying 5 times a day and other of the 5 pillars, it's a way of giving shape to your own life, of giving meaning to your own life. And, patterns of prayer and ritual are very attractive from that point of view. So it's got both a kind of intellectual dimension. Here's a kind of plausible view of the world. And there are lots of very intelligent people defending it, which of course is true. There were lots of very intelligent Roman Catholic thinkers who were, broadly speaking, defending Catholicism, and they had good arguments. Maybe not in the end, I've now decided, entirely convincing arguments, but they were arguments. But also the sort of more personal thing that, look, here is something that gives meaning and shape to your life in a way in which often modern people do suffer from this kind of anomie, as Durkheim called it, this kind of sense of rootlessness. What am I doing? What's the point of it all? Well, religions do offer an answer to that kind of more existential question about, what are we doing here? And so, religion's very attractive from that point of view. So I guess there was both the intellectual dimension and that they seem plausible enough. There were good arguments for it, and it's very attractive on a personal level. And I think actually it's really important to understand the attractiveness, the seductiveness, if you like, of religion. We sometimes say in the academic study of religion that if you've never been tempted to join a religion, you haven't really understood it, which is not to say you should join it. But you should at least have felt the temptation, because then you've kind of begun to understand what it's about.
Yes, I think one of the things that always fascinates me is because I've never been a believer. I've never gone through. I mean, my family, my mother was Christian. She went to church and sort of dragged me to church. I didn't really enjoy it, apart from the social side of it. But for me, one thing that I find very difficult to understand sometimes is this concept that at one point you wholeheartedly believed, God was real to you.
Yes.
And I've never had that, and that's why it's fascinating talking to people who either are religious or have been religious for me, because I've never gone through that process. It wasn't a normal thing in my family. We had a very sort of secular type upbringing, and so it's interesting to find, what was it just family? Was it just culture? Was it just the position you were in, the family you're in, the environment, that you just accepted that there was a God and just flowed with it? I understand the sort of the intellectual side and the philosophy and things like that. It's very attractive because it is an intellectual thing. You can think about things. Well, what was it that sort of just had that in your mind, that God obviously existed, and so you went into the priesthood?
I'm not sure if I'd say obviously there, but but you're right, of course. I was brought up in an environment which took belief in God for granted, and also kind of assumed that belief in God underpinned morality. Now, I think this is not necessarily true at all, of course, now, but at the time it seemed that if you abandoned belief in God, you ran the risk of sort of falling into a kind of moral nihilism where there was no truth, or there was no right or wrong was merely, to use your words, subjective, which of course would be catastrophic, I think. But I now see there's no necessary link there, that while religions do.
That's Jordan Peterson's argument when he argues that Western society is abandoning Judeo-Christian values, and apparently his only perspective is that we're going to just descend into nihilism. So it's a fairly common viewpoint amongst believers.
Yeah, and I think in a sense, I never thought I'd utter these words, in a sense Jordan Peterson is right. Those are the words I never thought I'd utter. In that If we simply abandoned the traditional moral principles without replacing them with anything, that would be catastrophic. To that extent, he's right. I don't actually see any sign of that happening. I think we're developing and have developed secular moral principles, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't, but that's the nature of moral principles. We're developing a kind of, and have developed, and of course, philosophers spend a lot of time trying to figure out what, rationally defensible ethical principles would look like outside of religion. So, so I think there's some truth in Jordan Peterson's view, but no reason for the alarm that he seems to feel, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've become a priest, and you obviously was going along with it, going with the flow, and everything was fine. What was the sort of the turning point? What was the catalyst? What happened in your mind that started moving you away from that sedentary thought?
Well, I think the background of this kind of more skeptical intellectual approach to the study of the Bible was important, but there's clearly a personal dimension to this as well, which was that I decided that it wasn't actually a good thing for me to try to live a celibate life, which of course the Roman Catholic Church demands of all priests. I think a big mistake for all sorts of reasons, but in any case, whether it was a big mistake or not for the church as a whole, it wasn't a good thing for me. And so eventually, when I met a prospective partner, it seemed this was the much better way for me to live than to try to continue to live as a priest. I've often wondered, had I been able to marry and remain a priest, would I have done so? Honestly, I don't know. Because of course, just as when you're living within a Catholic world, much seems self-evident about religion or taken for granted. Once you move out of that social environment, then of course your thinking begins to change as well, because our thinking is clearly influenced by the social environment in which we live. So that's a question I don't know what the answer is.
Were you still a priest when you met your wife?
Yes, I was, yes.
And was she a parishioner at the church, or you met her outside the church?
She was a practicing Catholic, yes, although not technically.
But was she at the church you were a priest in your parish?
At that point, I wasn't actually a parish priest. I was working in another capacity in the university, so it was a bit different. Yeah.
Okay.
Did you sort of find it sort of like when you came out of the priesthood that you started to see things in a different way? You started to see the church in a different way, maybe?
I think so. I think that's right. I mean, once you leave that environment, and as I say, it wasn't an environment I experienced negatively. In fact, even when I chose to leave the priesthood, many of my fellow clergy were actually surprisingly supportive. The quite senior priest with whom I had been living for some time before in a parish context, when I told him, he said, "Greg," he said, "we're really sorry to see you go, but look, if you're going to go now while you're still relatively young, you can have a family, establish a new life." And I thought, wow, that's a really generous kind of attitude to adopt. So again, I've never experienced the church as sort of an oppressive. No, I know lots of people have. Again, perhaps I'm just lucky, but it was.
Yeah, because we all have different lives, don't we? And
yeah,
the
that's
flow
right.
of life is, it happens. Things happen to different people in different ways. But
that's right.
I think
So
the sort of thing that fascinates me is the unveiling of it. So if you was in an environment and fully believed, and it sounds like when you decided to leave, that you still believed in God, you still had all of those things in you.
Yes.
So what was the process of, once you decided to leave the priesthood, What was the unveiling process? What, did you was it like peeking behind the curtain and thinking, well, that isn't right and that isn't right? And was it a gradual process, or was it just a switch?
No, there was no sort of dramatic switch. It's more kind of, I guess I drifted away from belief. I thought the whole idea of religious belief I'd love to talk about sometime, because I'm not sure just what it means. But I drifted away from belief, if you like, in the traditional sense, without really being aware of it. I kind of, there was no dramatic deconversion experience, as it were. I remember on one memorable occasion, where I've been talking about some religion-related topic about what people believe about this and that, because by this time had shifted into, I had been teaching biblical studies at the university as part of a theological program, which our local university had for various reasons, connection with the local churches. And I was lucky enough to be able to shift into religious studies, or the religion program, which didn't require you to be a believer. But so I was studying religion, and on one occasion I've been talking about some religious topic, and then Kristen, my wife, said to me, she said, okay, but what do you believe? As opposed to what other people believe. And I thought for a moment and said, I don't think I believe this anymore. I'd sort of drifted away without really being aware of having drifted away from a position of being committed to these things. But then again, I think this whole notion of religious belief, it's not like, religious belief, I think it's not like, I believe that it's cloudy today. Well, I do believe it's cloudy today, and it seems to be a true belief from what I can tell, or I believe the cat is in the kitchen, which I think is also a true belief. I mean, religious belief is different because it's more like a commitment to live as if something were true. And in a way, I'd already given up that commitment by ceasing to practice the faith. And so I think religious belief, the word belief is a bit misleading here. I talk a lot more about religious commitment, or you're committing yourself to live as if a certain set of propositions were true. Now, of course, when you do this, eventually they come to seem true to you, because that's just a psychological fact that Pascal noted in connection with his famous wager, but other people have studied too. Once you begin to live in a particular way, you look for confirming evidence, you sort of a confirmation bias kicks in, and you therefore come to see the things as true, which originally you committed yourself to without perhaps too much conviction. So I think belief is a product of religious commitment, but religious commitment, the commitment to live in a certain way, comes first. So I think once you cease to live in that way, then it's probably fairly natural that the sense of conviction drifts off as well.
And did your wife join you on that journey? Like she was a practicing Catholic when you met. So has she sort of followed you on your own migration away, or she's still a believer?
I think you should probably talk to her about that rather than me. But I won't speak for her in this context.
Okay.
Let's just say we're not radically at odds on this issue.
Okay.
Did you feel that it was because this does fascinate me, this whole step to belief, because a lot of the people I talk to who are theists are friends of mine, and I know they're good people, and I don't really sort of argue with them about whether God exists or not. We don't really have those arguments, but we've had conversations about.
These are the most tedious of arguments. I'm trying to shift the philosophy of religion away from arguing about whether God exists, which has become a terrible dead-end topic. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
It's just this concept of belief and non-belief. These things. I have a non-belief. I don't have any conviction that God exists. My friends that are religious and they say they believe in God, and it seems to be packaged to one side. It's like, outside of the real world, I also have this belief, and I'm going to hold on to that. Now, whether I can prove it or not is irrelevant. I don't care. It's just because it is a step of faith.
Well,
And
they seem to compartmentalize, and they kind of shut that down, and they don't question too much.
Because it seemed to me like that. Almost every single person I've talked about who I'm not in an argument with, not shouting match, but argumentation, discussion, that they do believe it. However, there's nothing they can say that will convince me that a God exists. And so the conversations are always fragmented and distant. It's not like something, as you say, that the cat is in the kitchen. There's proof, you can see the cat. And so this question of where you fell away from it is fascinating for me, where you decided that probably believing is no longer an option for you. And this is why I said, was it a sudden thing, or was it something that fell away over time? And how does that make you feel? What's the psychology of that? What's your mindset of that? How did you justify it, or have you justified it?
I guess there are two ways of being, or there are two meanings to the word atheist. You can be an atheist in the sense of one who affirms the non-existence of God. I believe there is no God. But you can be an atheist in a weaker sense, which borders on agnosticism, where you simply say, it is not the case that I believe there is a God, if you can see that distinction. In one case, you're positively affirming God's non-existence. In the other, you're simply saying, it's not the case that I affirm God's existence. Perhaps not.
Most atheists that I know will be quite happy to say that they don't know. I mean, to me, exactly. I'm still an atheist. I don't really see myself as, agnostic as such. It is to do with knowledge, but it's to me, it's just a worldview. It's just how I feel. It's just my little world. And this is why it's always fascinated me when people come out of religion and go from belief to non-belief, and what that structure is, what that mental structure is, how that actually, what's the bridge between that, and how did it work for you?
I suspect the bridge between it is ceasing to practice the religion. But, in Catholicism, it's always been very important to practice your religion. You must go to church every Sunday, you must do certain things. And of course, within many other religions, this is the case too. Protestant Christianity tends to focus on belief first, but Protestant Christianity is a bit of an outlier in the history of religions. You become a Muslim by practicing the 5 pillars of Islam. You become a Jew by observing the Torah. You practice your religion first. And of course, this is the way most people are introduced to a religion, by practicing it within their family, rather than by coming to some intellectual conclusion. So I think that
it's like reinforcing indoctrination, because I don't want to. Words are very, very weird. You can use it like indoctrination. It can be used in a hard way or a soft way. When I say indoctrination, just upbringing, environment, and that sort of thing, where you practice religion. And this, I think, this is the case for a lot of people, where if you're in a family that practices their religion, they go to church every Sunday, or they pray 5 times a day, or whatever it is, whatever that practice is. I think it's difficult for people to question it or stand back from it and look at it in a I'm going to use the word again, subjective way, rather than an objective value. If you're practicing it, do you keep in there, basically?
I think that's right. That once you're immersed in an environment in which everybody else is taking this conviction for granted, this principle, this idea for granted,
basically,
yeah, it's very hard for you not to also take it for granted, because that's the way we know we're social creatures. We inherit a lot of our attitudes and beliefs. We're not rugged individualists thinking everything out for ourselves, at least not in the first instance. I think, and of course, in a place like, in say medieval Europe, where this belief was much more widespread, there were skeptics, but it was probably psychologically harder as well as socially more dangerous to be a skeptic. And if you're living in a Jewish shtetl in Eastern Europe, in which everyone around you is practicing what we would call Orthodox Judaism, of course, this is just going to seem to you the obviously right way to live. All I want to say is that I think this applies to all of us, whether we're believers or not. The social environment we live in will have a significant influence. If you work in a department with a lot of skeptical, questioning philosophers, then of course you'll adopt a certain skeptical, questioning attitude. So I think this is not just true of religion, that our belief follows practice rather than practice following belief often, that it's the activities we engage in that shape how we see the world.
So when you decided to stop practicing the religion, did you start thinking in a slightly different way? Did you? I'm trying to think how to put this. When you came out of your religion and you stopped practicing the religion, you obviously started maybe thinking slightly a different way. Is that how it worked? You started thinking a different way, and you started questioning the religion or just the philosophy of the religion?
I don't know. It wasn't quite as conscious as that, I think. It's probably because, as I say, I just sort of discovered I'd drift away from a sense of conviction while continuing to study religion, because that's what I do for a living. So it was probably less conscious a process than your description suggests. And
so you were drifting away from the religion or your conviction, and you were having an issue with the celibacy. But I presume at the time you probably still believed in a God. At that time, the atheism probably evolved more slowly over time.
Yeah, that's true. The non-belief was something I discovered I had arrived at eventually.
Yeah.
But
were you surprised? Did it surprise you you arrived at that?
I was actually a little surprised. I thought, gosh, how did I get here? Okay, all right. This is where we are now. So it wasn't a matter of conscious choice, or I think unlike a religious commitment can be a matter of conscious choice, because I don't think you can choose to believe something directly. I often say this to my students, close your eyes now and choose to believe just by willing it. That when I wrote these lecture slides this morning, there was a cat sitting on my knee. Don't just imagine it. You must choose to believe it just by sheer willpower. Most people think that you can't do this. You can't simply will a sense of conviction. What you can choose, what you can will, is to live in a certain way, to undertake a certain set of practices. And I think becoming religious is better thought of as choosing to live, to embrace a certain set of practices, than to choosing to believe something directly. Now, of course, those practices assume the belief. So eventually, when you engage in the practices, there's a wonderful book by a scholar of religion called Tanya Luhrmann called Persuasions of the Witch's Craft. Have you come across her work? She's written a very interesting book on Protestant Christianity recently called, I think, When God Speaks Back. But she's an anthropologist, and she went and joined a Wiccan group, Wicca being, of course, the modern day witchcraft movement. So Wiccans think of themselves as witches. but they've got a very positive view of witchcraft. It's the using of magical rituals to bring about good effects. So Tanya Luhrmann joined a Wiccan group. As an anthropologist, she made it perfectly clear she was joining them as part of her participant observation to study the group. And they welcomed her. And then she wrote a book about it called Persuasions of the Witch's Craft. Beautiful title. Because what she found was, having engaged in what Wiccans call the craft, the practice of witchcraft, you eventually found yourself almost persuaded by it. She never quite became persuaded, but she wrote about the way in which, by immersing yourself in the practice, you come to see the world differently. I think it's a brilliant book. It's just wonderful. One of the modern classics, I think, in the study of religion.
Well,
Because
I'm going to read that because I had a dalliance with Wicca.
oh, did you?
Yeah, I mean, it was.
What was her name?
It is very, very persuasive in some ways, and I think the only reason is because of the people that I was involved with were very persuasive. But they never ever tell you that they are being persuasive. They don't give that away. They're just very, very nice people. You know, that's what happened to me. I just like had this dalliance with Wicca because they were incredibly nice people with a clarity of vision that I thought was pretty cool. It didn't take me too long to sort of go, actually, this isn't what I need. It really isn't what I need. But I understand where you're coming from. But I'd love to read that book, actually.
Yeah, but Andy, I think you're in a good position then to understand why people become religious.
Oh yeah,
Because
I mean, I do understand some of the things. It's I question some of the processes that are involved in bringing people into the religion when they're young, the indoctrination and the this what you call the practice of it is why people stick around, and they don't question enough of what it's actually what's actually psychologically happening to them, and putting skepticism to one side, you know, so they can't even see the problems anymore. It just blanks completely out, and that's why it's always intrigued me, this whole process of belief. And that's why I mean I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book as well, the one that I had a look at just the other day. I mean, I read it all through in about, you know, in less than a day, just like going through it. And you know, it's because it talks about this concept of religion as part of society, as part of culture, and the practices, you know, like Maoris and, you know, dreaming and all that sort of thing. And religion and culture go hand in hand, and it has done throughout, you know, human. So it's very, very interesting. And this whole thing about atheism and what it actually means to be atheist. Yeah, because it's a quite a grey area, but there seems to be a lot more people sort of questioning the concept of belief nowadays. Some people keep in it, and some people don't. Some people move out of it, but there's a lot of people more questioning the concepts of belief. It's almost like a black and white thing.
Yeah, I think it does require a lot more exploration. But although this was the deprovincializing science and religion book, I take it. It's just a wee book, of course, but yeah, I think that's right. The idea of belief requires a lot more exploration. And as I say, I think religious belief is different from what we would ordinarily call belief. It's a different category of thing, which is first and foremost a commitment to live in a particular way from which a conviction customarily follows. Which, after all, is what Pascal said as a result of this famous wager. You know, Pascal's got this wager, which many of your listeners will be aware of. You know, look, if God exists, should I believe? Well, if God exists, then I have the possibility of gaining an eternity of happiness. If God doesn't exist, what have I lost by believing, and so on. So sort of as a pragmatic choice, it's better to believe. And then Pascal's interlocutor, as it were, says, okay, I accept your argument, but I still don't believe. And Pascal says, just do the things you would do as if you believed. Act as if you believed. Just engage in the practices. Go to Mass. Do the things that a good 17th century Catholic would do. And the conviction will come upon you. Pascal was very astute, as you'd expect. I think that's right.
So where do you feel now? What's your sort of your point of view of life and as an atheist? Has it changed a lot? I mean, are you different? Are you a different person?
I probably am. I don't know. I don't like labels, and I even avoid the atheist label because people tend to assume I'm a Sam Hitchens or a Richard Dawkins or a Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, which I'm not. I'm not, engaged in a crusade against religion. That being said, there are things that really irritate me. And when I see the evangelical groups on campus, as I have over the last few days at the beginning of our academic year, as it is here, enticing homesick young undergraduates to join their group, I get a bit grumpy about what's going on here. So I'm capable of being irritated about religion, but I don't think of myself as engaged in a crusade against religion.
Listen, I think we've basically got to our stopping point. It's been absolutely fascinating as usual. I think we can definitely sort of, get into this a little bit more because to me it is a fascinating subject. This whole concept of belief and non-belief and how it fits in different places. I'd like to sort of do more with you about you maybe talking a little bit more about the book as well, because there were some really, really interesting things in there that made me think a lot about the concepts of religion and society and culture and all those sort of things, which is really interesting. But I think for now, Greg, it's been absolutely fantastic. We'll put links in to your stuff below the videos and on the podcast and things like that. So anyway, listen, thanks very much, Greg, and
You're welcome.
and really, really good to see you guys. And we'll see you next time. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. I'm Andy Phillips, and don't forget we're risen apes, not fallen angels. See you next time.